Elise Hartman woke up that Saturday with a feeling she couldn't quite place. A persistent emptiness, as if something were out of place, but she still didn't know what. The calendar hanging in her kitchen clearly marked the following day's event, her brother Nolan's wedding. She had bought an elegant dress, booked the hotel in advance, and even wrapped an expensive gift with her own hands. She planned to spend the morning with her Aunt Maxine, as she always did when she returned to the village. Although a part of her knew her relationship with her family was distant, she still held on to a small, stubborn, and painful hope of being treated as part of the whole. Maxine's house had that familiar scent of lavender, roasted coffee, and old wood. When she opened the door and saw Elise, her face tensed for just a second, but long enough for something to crack in the air. She hugged her tenderly, for a long time, like someone who wants to protect without saying anything. Then, as she put the kettle on the stove, she said in a trembling voice, "Elise ... The wedding is over, last weekend." For a moment, there was absolute silence. Maxine placed her cell phone on the table and scrolled through some open photos, Nolan with his wife Kendra. The decorated garden, family members Elise hadn't seen in years, everyone smiling, everyone present except for her. Elise froze as if her body had forgotten how to react. She stared at the photos like someone watching a movie, even though she knew every face on the screen. The envelope she'd received with the invitation clearly marked the wrong date. It wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. And for the first time in her life, she couldn't deny it or disguise it. Her exclusion had been deliberate, precisely planned. It wasn't a simple omission. It was a decision. They wanted her away. And not just from the wedding, but from everything that family represented. For years, Elise had supported them all from the shadows. She cosigned Nolan's bad loans, helped his parents financially when they nearly lost their house, even financed part of the family lake cabin. She never asked for recognition. She only longed for a little affection, something to make her feel worth more than her problem-solving skills. But now, sitting in that kitchen with cold hands and a raw heart, she realized that her place had never been with them. They only needed her when the fire was burning. Maxine sat across from her, her eyes filled with guilt. She confessed that she had tried to convince her sister Elise's mother to tell her the truth, to send her a proper invitation, to include her, but all had been ignored. They said it was better this way, that you always ruin family dynamics with your behavior, Maxine murmured, avoiding eye contact. Elise didn't cry. She felt a dry pressure in her chest, a bitter mix of humiliation, pent-up anger, and a sadness that no longer had room to expand. At that moment, she knew there was no going back. That same afternoon, Elise drove to the cabin on the lake. The drive, which would normally have moved her for its symbolic value, felt different. Cold upon arrival, she recognized her parents' and brother's cars in the driveway. She didn't get out of the car. She looked at the house she had helped build, the same one they'd said was an inheritance from the grandparents, even though she had the signed deeds locked in her safe. She saw her mother come out onto the porch, a cup in her hand, looking at her from a distance, without surprise, without guilt. Elise backed the car slowly and drove away without saying a word. In the days that followed, Maxine became her silent refuge. She made her tea, gave her space, and offered her something no one else had ever given her: validation. For the first time, Elise began reviewing documents, organizing emails, looking at old bank transfers. She realized how much she had given away. Not just money, but time, energy, care, and all to sustain a structure that was built by denying her emotional existence. As she gathered papers, she felt something inside her awakening. She would no longer be the functional daughter who solved problems from the sidelines. Something was about to change. With the help of Jenna, a lawyer she'd known since college and trusted deeply, Elise began to hatch a plan: legal, cold-blooded, impartial. She had proof that part of the cabin belonged to her. She could also trace the debts she'd covered in others' names. "This isn't about revenge," Jenna said, flipping through the papers. "It's about dignity." And Elise, for the first time in years, agreed without hesitation. I no longer wanted the love I'd never seen. I wanted justice. I wanted peace. Her parents' reaction was not long in coming. Her mother sent a brief message saying that there was no need to exaggerate things and that it was time to let go of old resentments. Elise didn't respond. Her silence was her first act of rupture. Shortly after, her father tried to call her 3 times in a single night. He left no messages. She had often noticed him absent, comfortable in the role of passive spectator. But now, not hearing his voice or receiving a sincere explanation, she understood that this omission had also been a constant choice. Elise blocked both numbers for the first time in her life. Together with Jenna, she drafted a formal letter notifying her parents of her intention to exercise legal rights to the cabin. She included copies of the documents proving her co-financing and partial ownership. She also demanded in a cold, polite tone that they vacate the premises within a reasonable time frame. It was the first real move. It didn't feel liberating. It felt sad, like burying a body. But it was also the first step toward Elise once again occupying a space in her own story, no longer as a family satellite but as a protagonist of her dignity. The response wasn't long in coming. An email written by Nolan, visibly impulsive and full of sarcasm, arrived 2 days later. He accused her of being mean, of not understanding what a real family means, and of acting as if money could buy human relationships. Elise read it silently, several times underlining the sentences with a blue pen. She didn't reply. She just filed the message in a folder called Reminders. It was the first time her brother had shown the full face of his contempt, and although it hurt, it was also a necessary revelation. In the midst of all this, Kendra, Nolan's wife, unexpectedly appeared. She wrote a long, honest message, apologizing. She confessed that she had felt pressured to maintain the lie, that it hadn't been her choice, and that now, married, she was beginning to see things in Nolan she had previously ignored. "You're not crazy, Elise. You were just forced to believe you were," she wrote. That message was a balm. Not because it validated everything, but because it reminded her that even amid so much abandonment, there were still voices willing to speak the truth. After that message, Elise decided to respond to Kendra with caution but gratitude. She didn't need anyone to become an ally to fight her battles for her, but she did deeply value honesty when it came without embellishment or hidden agendas. They met weeks later in a discreet downtown cafe where Kendra, with tears in her eyes, handed her a folder of documents and screenshots. Conversations between Nolan and her parents. Explicit plans to exclude her. Disparaging comments about her character, her independence, her need for attention. It was a hard blow, but it didn't hurt the same anymore. Now, everything fit. Everything had a name. With that information, Jenna was able to legally reinforce Elise's position in relation to benefits and loans that, for years, have been disguised as presents or favors. Meanwhile, Maxine remained firmly at her side, offering more than comfort. Stories. Old stories of Elise's mother's youth give shape to how she always competed with her mother, how she has since despised any sign of feminine autonomy that she could not control. "Your mother could never stand the fact that you didn't depend on anyone," Maxine said while reviewing old photos with storage files. As the plan took shape, Elise began to experience something new, a kind of uneasy peace. Not happiness, not joy, but a feeling of no longer swimming against a current that was always pulling her along. She began reconnecting with old friends, spending time with Thomas, her financial advisor, who over the years had also become a confidant, and looking at properties for sale near the lake, this time all by herself. Not out of nostalgia, but as a symbol of what she could build without having to ask anyone's permission or approval. One day, without warning, she traveled to the family cabin accompanied by an officer and a notary. Her parents weren't there, but the local caretaker opened the door and confirmed that most of their belongings had already been collected. Elise didn't cry. She walked through the rooms in silence, recognizing the objects, the furniture, the photos of a family that never truly included her. Then, in a symbolic act, she hung a small wooden sign at the entrance that read, "Private property, admission by invitation only." It wasn't revenge, it was order. It was respect, hers at last. As the months passed, Elise refurbished the cabin in her own style. She threw down heavy curtains, renovated the kitchen, and replaced the armchairs with light linen furniture. She didn't do it out of spite, but as an act of rewriting. Every corner, every detail, was a way of appropriating that space from another place. She painted the walls with her own hands, hung photos she'd taken on trips abroad, and filled the living room with books she'd always wanted to read uninterrupted. It was her home now, one she didn't have to share with emotional demands, blackmail, or disapproving glances. In this new cycle, Maxine, Jenna, and Thomas became her closest circle. There were no blood ties between them, but there was a genuine connection, woven through small acts and a constant presence. They celebrated her birthday together, organized impromptu dinners by the lake, and shared comfortable silences. Elise began to understand that family doesn't always mean origin, but rather choice. And that often the true support network is built outside the family tree. In this newfound freedom, she found a quiet joy, not euphoric, but profound. A year later, the white envelope arrived in the mail. It was an invitation from her cousin Kelsey to a family baptism, this time with the correct date, with her name lovingly written on it. Elise held it in her hands for several minutes, reading each word carefully. There was no resentment, no mockery, just a sincere invitation. But she'd already made other plans, a photography retreat on the coast, an activity she'd always put off because she prioritized. Others, she wrote a polite note thanking her for the invitation, but declined. Not out of anger, but out of loyalty to her new life. Shortly after, she received an unexpected letter from her father. His handwriting was shaky, as if time or guilt had affected his pulse. In it, he bluntly acknowledged his failings. He admitted to having been negligent, passive, and often unfair to her. He didn't explicitly ask for forgiveness, but it was the first time Elise had read, in words signed by him, a genuine acceptance of his pain. She didn't know what to do at first. She didn't cry. She didn't respond. She just kept the letter in a box next to the documents that marked his transformation, not out of attachment, but as a testimony of what he was, and of what he was no longer. As the days passed, Elise loosened the last threads that emotionally bound her to her old family dynamic. It wasn't about abruptly cutting ties, but rather about stopping nurturing one-sided relationships. She no longer sent messages on special occasions, nor waited for calls that never came, nor did she need to explain her decisions. Her energy shifted to taking care of herself, her body and mind. She began walking at dawn, enrolled in a pottery class, and took up photography with passion. She rediscovered her ability to be alone without feeling lonely. One autumn afternoon, as he arranged his photography equipment on the dock in front of the cabin, he felt free to breathe for the first time in a long time. The lake, once a symbol of exclusion, had become conquered territory. He captured an image of the tree's reflection in the water with a golden light that seemed almost unreal. When he reviewed it on the screen, he smiled. Not because it was a great photo, although it was, but because he understood that the image represented his inner state, serenity after the storm, fertile silence, new roots. Thomas, who visited her frequently, found her that evening making homemade soup and listening to soft jazz. "I didn't know you knew how to cook," he joked. Elise laughed genuinely, something she had previously struggled with. The conversation flowed without urgency, without masks. He didn't ask her about her family. He didn't need to. He knew there were wounds, but he also knew that Elise wasn't just that. It wasn't just a story of abandonment. She was a woman with a new narrative, woven with conscious choices, clear boundaries, and a tenderness she had learned to direct toward herself. At the end of that night, as she turned off the lights and closed the windows, Elise felt something different in her chest. It wasn't relief, it was gratitude. Not for what she'd been through, but for having survived it without becoming completely hardened. She knew her story could seem harsh, even cruel, but she also knew there was beauty in rebuilding. There was strength in not hitting back, in not repeating patterns. There was courage in simply choosing another path. And that, for her, was Enough, as time passed, the internal questions ceased to gnaw. She no longer questioned whether she had done the right thing, whether she should have insisted more, whether they would ever have loved her differently. Those questions dissolved like mist in the sun. In their place emerged a serene certainty. Some truths are simply non-negotiable, and one of them was that no one deserves to be a beggar for affection in their own family. Elise stopped trying to translate herself for those who never wanted to understand her. It was no longer her mission to fit in. Her mission was to exist in peace, as she was, with all that entailed. Weekends became sacred times. She and Maxine would gather to cook old recipes, sometimes in silence, other times giggling like children. Jenna would often visit with books under her arm, asking philosophical questions that led to late-night conversations. Thomas helped her set up a small virtual gallery of her photographs, and although he never said it out loud, it was clear he was proud. Elise began to understand that those bonds, born of mutual respect rather than obligation, were stronger than any blood ties that had wounded her. One summer night, as the sky filled with fireflies, Elise made a simple but powerful decision to write her story, not to publish it, not to seek approval, but to put into words what had silently inhabited her for years. She wrote in a navy blue notebook with black ink on pages that rustled as she turned. She didn't omit the dark moments, nor did she soften the betrayals. But she also made room for the small victories. Maxine's laughter in the kitchen. The first day she slept soundly, the moment she stopped waiting for a message that would never arrive. When she finished writing, she put the notebook in a drawer and poured herself a glass of wine. She stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, feeling the warm wood beneath her feet. The lake was still, reflecting the stars as if they were part of her own body. And there, in that meaningful silence, Elise understood that she didn't need an audience to validate her process. She had done it for herself, to heal, to remember, to never forget that dignity is not negotiable, and that her story, far from being an open wound, was now fertile ground where she could flourish without fear. A year after that morning at Maxine's house, Elise felt different. Not an improved or reinvented version of herself, but a freer, more real version. She had left behind the role of the useful daughter, the responsible sister, the woman who made decisions from the shadows. She no longer lived to please or to prove her worth. She lived for herself. She allowed herself mistakes, breaks, simple pleasures. She had turned the cabin into a living refuge, full of new memories and absences that no longer hurt. And when she thought about the past, she did so without resentment, only with the necessary distance to avoid repeating it. On one of her morning walks, she passed a neighbor who asked if she was Mr. Hartman's daughter. Elise smiled, thought for a few seconds, and calmly replied, "No, I'm just Elise." And she continued walking, certain that her identity was no longer tied to any surname, any imposed role, any enforced silence. She was the owner of her time, her words, her story. And in that autonomy, she found what she had never been given, belonging. But not to a broken family, but to a life she herself chose to build with care and truth. That day when she got home, she sat on the dock with her feet in the water. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and allowed herself to feel everything. The sadness that once drowned her, the pride of having endured, the calm of not owing explanations to anyone. Sometimes she thought that perhaps one day she could reconcile herself with parts of her story, but she no longer needed that to be at peace. She kept the letters, the photos, the documents not as proof, but as witnesses to her rebirth. Because Elise Hartman was not excluded, she was freed. And now, finally, she lived without asking permission.